There are moments in life when a single sentence can reshape your entire world, not because of what those words literally mean, but because of who speaks them and the circumstances surrounding that confession. This is the story of two people from completely different worlds who found each other in the most unexpected way. It's not a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but it's real, raw, and deeply human. What happened between them started as a chance meeting, developed into an unlikely friendship, and eventually transformed into something neither of them saw coming. The journey they embarked upon together would test everything they believed about love, loyalty, and belonging. By the end of their story, 3 simple words would carry the weight of impossible choices and unwavering devotion. This is that story. The dust was still settling on the reservation when Sarah first saw him. Not literally settling from dust, but the kind of settling that happens when you watch life go on despite everything trying to fall apart. She had been driving on the winding roads near the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona for what felt like forever, though it had only been 3 months. Her job as a documentary filmmaker had brought her to this remote corner of the American Southwest to capture stories that rarely made it to mainstream media. Her producer had given her a simple directive: find authentic narratives, real people with real struggles, and tell their stories without the romanticized filter that most media outlets applied to Native American communities. Sarah was 32 years old, divorced, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from building a career in an industry that constantly demanded more. She had always been drawn to stories that challenged people's perceptions. Growing up in California, she had been surrounded by bubble-wrap narratives and manufactured outrage. She wanted something different. She wanted truth. That's what had led her to Arizona, to this dusty stretch of land where the mountains touched the sky in ways they never did in the city. The community she was living in was small, tight-knit, and initially suspicious of her presence. A white woman with expensive camera equipment asking intrusive questions wasn't exactly welcome with open arms. She understood that. She had expected it. What she hadn't expected was how much that reservation would feel like home within weeks, or how completely her presence would eventually transform the life of someone she hadn't even met yet. Marcus was a name she kept hearing in whispered conversations at the small grocery store, in the diner where she ate lunch, and in the conversations that sometimes stopped abruptly when she walked into a room. The whispers suggested complexity. They suggested someone important, someone with authority, someone with a past. When she finally asked directly about him, the responses were vague. "He runs things around here," one elder told her. "He's the one holding things together," another said. Nobody wanted to say much more than that, and Sarah respected that boundary. She didn't push. Instead, she waited. And waiting proved to be the right strategy. The community center had organized a gathering for young people, an initiative meant to keep teenagers engaged and away from the substance abuse that had plagued the reservation for years. Sarah had asked permission to film parts of the event, and they had agreed, though she could sense the community leaders were still making up their minds about whether she was trustworthy. She arrived early, setting up her equipment in the corner, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. That's when Marcus walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively pay attention. He couldn't have been more than 45, but he carried himself with the weight of someone much older. His face was lined in a way that suggested struggle and hard-won wisdom. When his dark eyes scanned the room and landed on Sarah, she felt something shift. It wasn't attraction, though he was certainly an attractive man. It was recognition, not of each other specifically, but of kindred spirits who had both experienced more than they had wanted to experience. He approached her directly, which surprised her. Most people at the reservation approached her with careful distance. "You're the filmmaker," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was measured, calm, the kind of voice that suggested he didn't waste words on unnecessary things. "I am," Sarah replied, extending her hand. "Sarah Mitchell." He took her hand firmly. "Marcus Whitehorse. I run the youth programs here." There was a slight pause before he added, "And a few other things." They talked for 15 minutes before the event started. Just surface-level conversation about her project, about Arizona, about the weather. But underneath that surface-level chat, there was a current of something else. It wasn't flirtation. It was more like two people who had both walked through fire, recognizing that same scent in each other. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself returning to the community center more frequently than her project actually required. She told herself it was for the content, for the stories, That was partly true, but another part of her knew she was creating reasons to be in spaces where Marcus might be. When she finally admitted this to herself while driving back to her rental house one evening, she felt foolish. She was here for work. She was here to tell stories. Getting involved with someone was not part of the plan. It was never part of the plan. Marcus wasn't looking for involvement either. His life was consumed by the youth programs, by community disputes that needed mediating, by the constant undercurrent of crisis that seemed to flow through reservation life. He had been married once, years ago, to a woman he had deeply loved. That marriage had ended because of his commitment to the community. Or so he had always told himself. The truth was probably more complicated than that. There had been an affair. There had been broken promises. There had been the slow realization that he could not be both a good husband and the person the community needed him to be. He had chosen the community. Then Sarah arrived, with her cameras and her genuine questions and her way of looking at people like she was actually seeing them. She didn't treat him like a local curiosity or a spokesperson for all Native American experiences. She treated him like a person with a complicated internal world, which made him want to share that world with her. The first real conversation happened at the diner on a Tuesday evening. Sarah had been at the community center all day, filming interviews with teenagers about their lives, their dreams, their struggles. She was emotionally drained, the way she always was after absorbing other people's pain all day. She had stopped at the diner for coffee and pie, hoping the sugar and caffeine would restore her enough to edit footage in her hotel room. Marcus was there, sitting in a booth at the back, papers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered. "Burning the midnight oil?" he asked as she approached. It was only 7 o'clock, but on the reservation that qualified as late. She laughed, a real laugh. "Trying to. I'm attempting to eat pie and pretend I'm not emotionally exhausted." "Sit," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I'm done with this." He gathered his papers, which appeared to be grant applications and budget projections. Sarah sat down. They talked through 2 pots of coffee and the diner's entire pie inventory. He told her about growing up on the reservation, about his father who had been a respected elder, about his struggles with substance abuse in his 20s and his decision to get clean. He talked about returning to school as an adult, about coming back to the community with a determination to make things better. He didn't give her a sanitized version. He included his failures, his continuing struggles, the constant guilt of knowing there was more he could do but not having the resources to do it. Sarah shared her own story in return, about her childhood in a wealthy neighborhood where everything was supposed to be perfect but nothing felt authentic, about her first marriage to a man her parents had approved of, a marriage that had slowly suffocated her, about her realization that she needed to see the world through her camera lens, needed to find truth in places where nobody was performing for an audience. When the diner closed around midnight and they walked out into the Arizona night, the air was cool and filled with stars in a way it never was in California. Marcus walked her to her car. For a moment, she thought he might try to kiss her. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to or if she wanted to run. He did neither. Instead, he said, "Come to dinner at my house on Saturday. I'll cook." "Is this a date?" she asked, needing to know the intention. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I don't know what this is, but I know that I want to know you better." Saturday dinner became a routine. Then it became more than a routine. Sarah found herself telling Marcus things she had never told anyone. She found herself crying in his kitchen while he prepared food she had never tasted before. Traditional Apache dishes his mother had taught him to make. She found herself staying later and later, first leaving at midnight, then 2 in the morning, then not leaving until the sun was already up. They didn't officially become a couple. There was no moment where they sat down and defined a relationship. Instead, there was a slow merging of their lives. Sarah moved her filming equipment into Marcus's spare room. She was still officially renting her hotel room in town, but she barely went there anymore. The community definitely noticed. Whispers became conversations. Some people seemed genuinely happy for them. Others clearly disapproved. The disapproval came from multiple directions. Some of it was obvious racism, from white ranchers in the area who didn't like the idea of a white woman with an Apache man. That kind of disapproval Sarah could handle. She had encountered that all her life. What was harder was the disapproval from within the community. There were people who thought Marcus was betraying his people by being with her, that his relationship with a white woman somehow diminished his commitment to the reservation. That hurt Marcus in ways that Sarah couldn't fully understand. 3 months into their relationship, Marcus came home late one evening, and Sarah could see that something was wrong. His jaw was tight. His eyes held something like shame. She waited for him to speak first, a curtsy she had learned to extend to him because she knew his mind worked differently than hers. He processed things internally before externalizing them. "Thomas Crow called a meeting," Marcus finally said, referring to the tribal council chair. "There's discussion about whether I should step down from my position. They're saying my relationship with you is a distraction, that it's sending the wrong message to the community." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that my relationship was my business." "But Sarah, you need to understand how this works here. Everything is everyone's business." "There's no separation between personal and professional, not really." She moved toward him, but he held up his hand, not quite pushing her away but creating distance. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Are you here for this place, or are you here for me?" It was a fair question, and Sarah appreciated that he asked it directly. The answer was complicated. She was here for the documentary, or at least she had been initially. But her documentary had evolved. It had become less about documenting external narratives and more about understanding the internal landscape of the people who lived here. And that internal landscape had become inseparable from Marcus. He was no longer a subject in her film. He was the center of her world, and that had changed everything about how she approached her work. "I'm here for both," she said, "but if I had to choose, I'm here for you." Marcus closed his eyes. That might not be enough. That might actually make this harder. The crisis was averted temporarily, but only because Sarah made a decision. She withdrew from the community center. She stopped filming content that involved Marcus directly. She became less visible in public spaces. She told her producer that her timeline had extended and that she was taking on a more observational approach rather than participatory filming. None of it was technically a lie, but it wasn't entirely true either. Marcus appreciated the effort, but Sarah could see that it cost him something. He could see that she was shrinking herself to fit into the space that his community had decided was acceptable for her. One night, a month after his conversation with the tribal council, he found her crying in their bedroom. She was trying to hide it, but he heard the sounds and lay down beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I don't recognize myself anymore," she said. "I came here to tell stories, to document truth. Now I'm deleting footage, censoring my own work, making myself invisible. I'm becoming a ghost." Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He just held her while she cried. And she understood in that moment that this was the real test of their relationship. It wasn't whether they could overcome external opposition. It was whether they could be themselves while being together. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She called her producer and told her that she was taking a 6-month break from the documentary. She couldn't work on it anymore. When he asked why, she didn't give him all the details. She just said that she had realized her presence was affecting the community in ways that weren't helpful, and she needed to step back. "Is this about a person?" he asked shrewdly. "It's about the right thing to do," she replied. She also sat down with Marcus and told him what she had done. She told him that she was staying, but not as a filmmaker. She was staying because she wanted to be here, in his house, in his community, in his life. She wanted to figure out what came next without a camera between them and their reality. Marcus listened, and when she finished speaking, he pulled her close. "You know this might not work out, right? We might want different things eventually. The community might never accept this. There are a lot of ways this could go wrong." "I know," Sarah said, "but I also know that I love you, and I want to try." It was the first time either of them had said that word, love. It hung in the air between them, real and fragile, and somehow both terrifying and perfect. That night, Marcus held her differently than he had before. It wasn't protective. It was accepting. It was the way someone holds another person when they have finally allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they don't have to walk through life alone. 6 months passed quietly, which in Sarah's experience meant that something was building. Happiness, in her observation, was never permanent unless you were willing to fight for it constantly. She had learned that lesson from her first marriage, though she had learned it too late. This time, she was watching for the cracks before they became breaks. She found work at the community center, initially as a volunteer and eventually as a coordinator for the cultural programs. It wasn't what she had trained for, and it paid nothing at first, but it gave her purpose beyond her relationship with Marcus. She was building a separate identity in this place, one that didn't rely entirely on him. That felt important. She saw too many women lose themselves in relationships, and she had no intention of becoming one of them, even though some days the pull toward that kind of surrender was strong. Marcus was supportive of her work at the community center, but Sarah noticed that he remained cautious about their relationship's visibility. They didn't go out together in public very often. They didn't attend events as a couple. In private, he was warm and engaged and present. In public, he was polite but distant. Sarah told herself it was about protecting the community, about managing perceptions, about the complicated politics of leadership. But deep down, it bothered her. It felt like he was ashamed, or at the very least conflicted about her place in his life. The first real conflict came when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization hit her while she was driving home from the community center, and she had to pull over because her hands were shaking. A pregnancy was not something they had discussed. They had been careful, or she had thought they had been careful, but clearly something had failed. She was 46 years old. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been so focused on avoiding her mother's path of accidental pregnancies and compromised dreams that she had assumed her body was past the point of surprising her. She sat in her car for 3 hours before going home. She rehearsed conversations in her head. She imagined scenarios where Marcus felt trapped, where he wanted her to have an abortion, where he decided that this was the moment he realized he couldn't be with her. She imagined him asking her to leave the reservation, leave his life, leave everything they had built. She prepared herself for abandonment in every form it could take. When Marcus came home that evening, she showed him the pregnancy test without preamble. She couldn't do the gentle reveal. She needed to see his immediate reaction, unfiltered by any consideration for her feelings. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at the plastic stick like it was an artifact from another planet. "Are you sure?" he finally asked. "The test was positive. I'm going to get a blood test tomorrow to confirm, but yes, I'm pretty sure." He sat down slowly. Sarah remained standing, watching him process. This was the moment, she thought. This was where he would tell her that he had never wanted this, that he had made a mistake with her, that his community was right to question their relationship. "I thought I couldn't have kids anymore," Marcus said quietly. He had mentioned this once in passing during one of their late-night conversations. His ex-wife had never gotten pregnant during their marriage. He had assumed it was something wrong with him. He had made peace with it years ago. "Does it matter?" Sarah asked carefully. "Do you want this baby?" Marcus looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe, this was going to be okay. "I want to want this baby," he said. "And I think I actually do want it, but I'm terrified of having a kid at this point in my life, of what the community will say, of whether I can be a good father, of what happens if we don't work out and I have to share custody, or lose custody, or something terrible." He paused. "Of losing you. That's the biggest one. I don't know how to be a father and still be the person this community needs me to be." Sarah sat down beside him and took his hand. "So we figure it out together. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to decide if we want to try. We're going to have to tell people," Marcus said, and she could hear the dread in his voice. "I know. We can wait a few weeks until the blood test confirms everything, and then we tell them." They waited exactly 2 weeks, and in that time, the pregnancy became real to Marcus in a way it hadn't been initially. He came with her to the first ultrasound, and when the technician showed them the tiny flutter of the heartbeat, he cried. Sarah had never seen Marcus cry before, and it shook something loose inside her. She realized in that moment that he was just as scared and uncertain about everything as she was. He was just better at hiding it. The community's reaction was mixed, which was slightly better than Sarah had expected, but still difficult to navigate. Some people were genuinely happy. Some people were pointedly silent. Some people congratulated Marcus while studiously ignoring Sarah. The tribal council brought Marcus in for another meeting, and when he came home afterward, he was visibly shaken. "They wanted me to consider stepping down," he said flatly. "They're saying that an unmarried couple having a baby sends the wrong message to the young people in the community. They're saying it's hypocritical for me to run the youth programs and preach about responsibility while I'm not modeling it." "Are you going to step down?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. No, I'm going to propose to you instead. It wasn't romantic. There was no ring. He said it while they were both sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee. He said it like a solution to a problem, which in some ways it was. But when he took her hand and asked her if she would marry him, Sarah understood that underneath the pragmatism was genuine feeling. He wanted to marry her. The tribal council pressure had provided the impetus, but the desire was real. I need to know something, she said. Are you doing this because you want to marry me, or are you doing this because the community is pressuring you? Both, Marcus said honestly. And that's okay. That's how life works sometimes. We don't always get to separate our personal wants from our communal obligations. But yes, I want to marry you. I want this baby. I want the life we're building together. And I want to stop hiding that from everyone. They got married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the community center. It wasn't elaborate. There were no white dresses or expensive flowers. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that accommodated her growing belly, and Marcus wore his best jeans and a traditional Apache shirt that his sister had made for him years ago. The community elder, a woman named Diane, who had always been kind to Sarah, performed the ceremony. Some community members attended. Some, notably, did not. The marriage changed something in how people treated Sarah, though not always in positive ways. Some people became warmer, recognizing her as officially connected to the community now. Others seemed to view her as a threat, a white woman who had infiltrated their world by marrying one of their own. Sarah found herself occupying a strange middle ground. She was no longer quite an outsider, but she would never be quite an insider either. Her pregnancy progressed normally, but the emotional landscape of it was complicated. She had imagined the excitement of carrying a baby, but instead she found herself consumed by anxiety. She worried constantly that something would go wrong. She worried that she would be a bad mother. She worried that Marcus would resent her if the baby caused problems in his career or his relationship with the community. She worried that the baby would grow up confused about its identity, belonging fully to neither the white world nor the Apache world. Marcus tried to reassure her, but he was dealing with his own anxieties. He was facing increased pressure at work, with some community members openly questioning his judgment in marrying a white woman. There were whispers about his future as a leader, about whether he could be trusted to represent the community's best interests when he was so obviously influenced by outsiders. One meeting with the tribal council got heated enough that Marcus came home angry for the first time since Sarah had known him. "They're questioning my heritage," he said, his voice tight with rage. "They're suggesting that my commitment to the Apache people is compromised because I love a white woman. Do you know how insulting that is? Do you understand what they're implying?" Sarah held him while he raged, and she felt the weight of her presence in his life in a new way. She had known it would be difficult, but she hadn't fully anticipated how deeply this would cut him. He had spent his entire adult life proving his commitment to the community. One relationship was threatening to undo decades of work and trust. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly, hating herself for the suggestion even as she made it. "No." Marcus pulled back to look at her. "No. I didn't marry you so you could run away the moment things got hard. We're in this together. The community is going to have to accept that." But the community was not going to make acceptance easy. In the months leading up to the baby's birth, Sarah felt increasingly isolated. She would work at the community center and feel eyes on her, feel the hesitation in people's voices when they addressed her. She knew they were talking about her, about Marcus, about whether this entire situation was a mistake. The gossip followed her everywhere, invisible but pervasive as smoke. It was a conversation with her mother that finally broke something open. Her mother had called after months of minimal contact, asking about the pregnancy, offering to come visit. Sarah, exhausted and emotional, had lashed out, telling her mother that this was exactly why she had left California, why she had needed to get away from people who questioned her choices. Her mother, hurt and defensive, had asked if she regretted marrying Marcus, if she was happy at all. Sarah had hung up without answering. Later that night, sitting alone in the darkness of their bedroom while Marcus worked late at the community center, Sarah had a moment of absolute clarity. She was isolating herself. She was cutting off her mother, maintaining distance from her friends back in California, putting all of her emotional energy into this relationship and this place. She was recreating the exact dynamic that had made her feel suffocated in her first marriage. She was disappearing again. becoming smaller and smaller to fit into the space people thought she should occupy. She called her mother back and apologized. More importantly, she called a therapist in the nearest large town and scheduled weekly video sessions. She started talking to Marcus about her fears, really talking to him, not just accepting his reassurances and moving on. She also made a decision about her career. She was going to finish her documentary. She was going to edit all the footage she had gathered, and she was going to tell the stories she had come here to tell. If the community didn't like it, that was something they would have to deal with. Marcus's reaction to this news was complicated. She could see him working through his feelings, weighing his fear of what the documentary might contain against his respect for her need to do her work. Finally, he said, "What are you planning to say about us? About our relationship?" "The truth," Sarah said, "that two people from different worlds fell in love, that it's been complicated and difficult and worth it, that your community is struggling with fears about cultural erosion and identity, which I understand and respect even though I don't agree with everything that fear manifests as, that we're trying to build something real despite all of that." "That's fair," Marcus said.
"But it's gonna upset people." "I know, but I can't live my life trying not to upset people."
"And I don't think you should either." 6 weeks before the baby was due, Sarah had her first real conversation with one of the older women in the community, a woman named Clara who ran the craft workshop at the community center. Clara had always been polite to her but distant. Sarah had assumed Clara was one of the people who disapproved of her relationship with Marcus. One afternoon, Clara asked Sarah to stay late after her shift and help clean out the workshop. While they worked, Clara began to talk. She told Sarah that her own daughter had married a white man 30 years ago, against the community's wishes. The community had been harsh about it. Clara's daughter had eventually left the reservation, unable to handle the constant judgment. Clara had regretted how she had handled the situation for decades. "I was too hard on her," Clara said, sorting through bolts of cloth. "I was too focused on protecting something that was changing anyway. What I should have been focused on was my daughter's happiness. By the time I realized that, she was gone. I see her maybe once a year now, and her children don't know much about being Apache because they grew up thousands of miles away." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you saying you support Marcus and me?" "I'm saying I don't want to watch the same thing happen again," Clara said. "And I'm going to tell other people that too. Change is hard for communities. It's scary. But rejecting people who love each other doesn't actually protect your culture. It just makes it smaller." Clara's words spread through the community in ways that Sarah didn't fully understand until later. It wasn't that everyone suddenly accepted their relationship, but some people stopped opposing it so actively. Some people started treating Sarah with something approaching warmth. The atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. People began to see Sarah not as a threat, but as someone who had chosen to be part of their community despite the difficulties. 2 weeks before the baby's due date, Marcus came home with news. He had been offered a position on the tribal council. It was a tremendous honor, a sign of his leadership potential. It was also, Sarah realized, a sign that the community had made a decision about him. They were not going to punish him for his relationship with her. They were going to embrace him as a leader, and that embrace implicitly accepted her as part of his life. That night, as Sarah lay in bed unable to sleep because of the physical discomfort of late pregnancy, Marcus wrapped himself around her carefully, his hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he had said those words in a long time. The stress of the past months had made them both too focused on survival to articulate deeper feelings. Sarah turned as much as her pregnant body allowed and kissed him. "I love you too. And I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." "I want you to stay," Marcus said. "I want you to stay forever." But they both knew that forever was a concept that required constant maintenance, constant choice, constant recommitment. Forever wasn't something you achieved. It was something you practiced day after day, decision after decision. The baby was born 3 days later. A girl with Sarah's blonde hair and Marcus's dark eyes. They named her Emma. And when Sarah first held her, she understood what people meant when they talked about love at first sight. It wasn't romantic love. It was something fiercer, more fundamental. It was the kind of love that would make her fight for this child's future, this child's sense of belonging, this child's right to exist proudly in both worlds. Motherhood transformed Sarah in ways she had not anticipated. She had read the books about pregnancy and postpartum adjustment. She had prepared herself mentally for the sleep deprivation and the physical recovery. What she had not prepared for was the way that Emma's existence would make her understand why people fought so fiercely for their communities and their cultures. Looking at her daughter's face, at those dark eyes that held both their heritages, Sarah began to comprehend Marcus's earlier anxieties about identity and belonging. Emma was biracial in a world that still struggled with what that meant. She was Apache and white, but she was not going to be comfortably accepted in either category. On the reservation, some people would always see her as half-white. In the broader American world, she would be classified by the color of her skin, or forced to check boxes that didn't really fit. Sarah had spent her whole life feeling like she didn't fit anywhere, and she was determined that Emma would have a different experience. The first year of Emma's life was not easy. Sarah recovered slowly from the birth, struggling with postpartum depression that she didn't immediately recognize as such. She had always been a functional person, someone who could manage crises and produce good work under pressure. But motherhood wasn't a crisis she could solve or work she could complete. It was a state of constant low-level anxiety and overwhelming responsibility that had no finish line. The exhaustion was physical and emotional and spiritual all at once. Marcus was attentive and helpful, but there were moments when Sarah felt deeply alone. He would wake up easily when the baby cried and jump into action while she lay in bed, still depleted from the pregnancy and the birth. He would offer suggestions about feeding schedules and sleep training that came from parenting books rather than intuition, and she would bite her tongue rather than tell him that she didn't need solutions right now. She needed support. 3 months postpartum, in the middle of the night while Emma was sleeping and Marcus was at a tribal council meeting that had run late, Sarah sat on the back porch and seriously considered leaving. Not leaving Marcus exactly, but leaving the reservation, taking Emma, starting over somewhere neutral where she wouldn't feel like she was constantly being evaluated as either too white or not white enough, too committed to the community, or exploiting it for her documentary. She called her therapist at 3 a.m, knowing the woman had a policy about crisis calls. When her therapist answered, Sarah found she couldn't quite articulate what the crisis was. Everything was fine. Marcus was supportive. Emma was healthy. The community had mostly accepted her, but she felt like she was drowning in a room full of air. That's postpartum depression, her therapist said gently. And Sarah felt something shift. She had a name for it. It wasn't a personal failure. It wasn't weakness. It was a medical condition, and it could be treated. She started medication a week later, and within 3 weeks, she could feel the difference. The fog lifted slightly. The constant anxiety didn't disappear, but it became manageable. She could hold Emma without the crushing fear that something terrible would happen. She could look at Marcus without resenting him for not understanding what she was going through. She could imagine a future beyond the next day, the next night, the next feed. It was during this period of recovery that her documentary began to take real shape in her mind. The footage she had gathered before the pregnancy had given her the external structure, but now, with Emma and her own experience of depression and displacement, she understood what the real story was. It wasn't just about the Apache community or about Marcus or even about their relationship. It was about how different people navigated the tension between individual desire and communal obligation, between authenticity and belonging, between holding on to tradition and allowing yourself to evolve. She started editing with a new intention, and she asked Marcus if he was ready to watch what she had created. She didn't ask permission. Exactly. She had learned that lesson the hard way early in her career, but she asked him to be willing to see how she saw his world, through her lens and with her perspective. One evening, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, Marcus sat down at Sarah's makeshift editing desk, and Sarah played the 40-minute cut she had completed. It was raw and unflinching. It showed the problems on the reservation without flinching from them. It showed the beauty of the culture without romanticizing it. And it showed Marcus's work, his dedication, his genuine commitment to his community. When it finished, Marcus was silent for a long time. Sarah waited, not pushing, letting him process in the way she had learned he needed to. "You made me look like a good person," he said finally. "You were a good person," Sarah replied. "But I also didn't hide the difficult parts. I didn't hide that you struggle sometimes, that you make mistakes, that you're trying to balance impossible things. What about us? About your relationship to the community? I'm in it. That's what I showed. I'm someone who came from outside, and I became part of something larger. It wasn't easy. I don't think I hid that. but I also showed that it was worth it. Marcus watched the documentary 3 more times over the following weeks. He made suggestions about specific sections, and Sarah incorporated some of them and rejected others. It was a collaboration, but Sarah understood that it had to ultimately be her story to tell. That was the only way it would have integrity. Before the documentary premiered at a film festival in Tucson, Marcus asked Sarah to speak at a community gathering. He wanted the people of the reservation to see it first, before it was released to the world. He wanted them to understand her intentions and her perspective before strangers began to comment on it. The night of the screening, the community center was packed. Sarah hadn't expected that. She had thought maybe 50 or 100 people would show up. Instead, there were over 200, including many people who had never spoken to her directly, who she had only encountered in passing. Before the screening began, Marcus stood up and spoke. He talked about his initial hesitation about Sarah and her project. He talked about his fear that she would exploit their community or create a distorted picture of their lives. And then he talked about how his perspective had shifted as he got to know her, as he realized that she was genuinely trying to understand and represent their stories fairly. "She's my wife," he said, and some people smiled at that simple statement. "She's Emma's mother. She's part of this community, even though she wasn't born into it. And what she's created is something that shows who we are, not who we were, not who we're supposed to be, who we actually are in this moment, with all our struggles and our hopes and our failures and our achievements. I think you should see it with open minds." The documentary was met with mixed reactions. Some people loved it. Some people cried, seeing themselves and their struggles on screen. Some people were upset about particular scenes or about things they perceived as negative. One woman stood up after the screening and said she thought Sarah was exploiting their pain for profit and notoriety. Sarah listened to all the feedback without being defensive. She acknowledged when people raised valid points. She explained her perspective when she thought it was important, and then she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. "I came here almost 3 years ago as an outsider," she said. "I came with cameras and questions and a desire to tell authentic stories. But what I found was more complicated than good stories. I found a place that changed me. I found a man I loved. I found a community that challenged me to examine my own privileges and biases. I'm not going to pretend that everything I've done or everything that's in this documentary is perfect, but I can tell you that it comes from a place of genuine respect and genuine care. If I made mistakes in how I represented anything or anyone, I apologize. But I cannot apologize for coming here or for staying here or for trying to tell this story as truthfully as I know how." The documentary premiered at the Tucson Film Festival 2 weeks later, and it won an award for documentary photography and storytelling. It played at other festivals. It was eventually picked up by a streaming service, and slowly, gradually, it found an audience beyond the reservation. The response was largely positive, though there were the inevitable critics who thought it was either too sympathetic to the Native American experience or not sympathetic enough, depending on their perspective. But what mattered most to Sarah was the response within the community. Over the following months and years, she noticed the shift. Young people watched themselves in the documentary and felt seen. Elders saw their stories preserved. The broader conversation about the reservation and about Apache culture expanded in ways that Sarah hadn't anticipated. 4 years after Emma's birth, Sarah was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was planned. Marcus had asked her, carefully and with his characteristic hesitation, if she wanted another child. She had said yes without hesitation. This second child, a boy they named Thomas after his great-grandfather, came into the world in a completely different atmosphere. The community was supportive and excited. The second baby meant, statistically, that Sarah wasn't going anywhere. She was committed to this life. Emma, now 5 years old, was intensely protective of her baby brother. She refused to let anyone, including her grandmother from the reservation, hold him without her close by. She spoke Apache at home with her father and English with her mother, switching between the two languages with the ease of a child who had never questioned her right to occupy both worlds. On Thomas's first birthday, Clara came to their house for the celebration. She had become a close friend to Sarah over the years, a mentor and confidant. As they sat on the back porch watching Emma and Thomas play, Clara took Sarah's hand. "I never got to say thank you," Clara said, "for making the documentary, for telling our stories the way you did, for showing people that we're not a museum exhibit or a cautionary tale. We're just people, trying to live our lives with meaning and connection. You sure that? And it mattered. Sarah squeezed Clara's hand, and she felt the weight of the journey they had taken together as a community, as a family, as individuals trying to build something real. That evening, after their guests had gone home and the children were asleep, Sarah stood in the kitchen and told Marcus something she had been thinking about for months. "I'm yours," she said. "I know you've never asked me to be. I know you've always wanted me to maintain my independence and my identity separate from you. But I want you to know that I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing Emma. I'm choosing Thomas. I'm choosing this community and this life. Completely and utterly. I'm yours." Marcus looked up from the dishes he was washing, and she could see the question in his eyes. Why was she telling him this now? "'Cause I needed to say it," she continued. "Because for so long I was afraid of disappearing into a relationship. I was afraid of becoming someone's wife instead of being myself. But I've learned that those things aren't mutually exclusive. I can be myself and be yours. I can have my own identity and be fully committed to you. I can love you completely and still be the person I want to be." I needed to say that out loud so I could really believe it. Marcus pulled her into his arms, and he held her the way he had held her the first night she had told him she was staying, the way he held her whenever she needed to feel anchored to something real and solid and true. "I'm yours too," he said. "I have been since that first night at the diner. I was just too scared to admit it." They stayed like that for a long time, not talking, just existing together in the comfort of a love that had been tested and complicated, and had survived all the complications because it was rooted in something genuine. Years later, when Emma was a teenager and Thomas was approaching double digits, Emma asked her mother if she regretted coming to the reservation, if she regretted giving up her career as a filmmaker to be a mother and a community member. Sarah thought about the question seriously. She thought about the life she would have had if she had stayed in California, if she had never met Marcus, if she had never had children. That life would have had its own satisfactions and its own struggles. "No," she said finally, "but I don't see it as giving up my career. I changed what my work looks like. I still tell stories. I just tell them differently now. I work with the community to create content about our traditions and our lives. I mentor young people who want to become filmmakers. And most importantly, I live the story instead of just documenting it. That's not giving up. That's evolution." "Do you think you and Dad would have stayed together if the community had completely rejected you?" It was a mature question, and Sarah answered it with honesty. "I don't know. That's the thing about real love, honey. It's not about whether external circumstances align perfectly. It's about deciding every single day that you want to stay, that you want to work through the hard parts, that the other person is worth the effort. If the community had completely rejected us, it would have been harder. But I think we would have found a way, because we both chose to." What Sarah didn't tell her daughter was that she had asked herself that same question many times, especially during the difficult early years. She had wondered if her love for Marcus was real, or if it was actually a love of the idea of him, of the narrative she was creating with him as the center. She had wondered if she had romanticized his struggles and his commitment to the community, if she was actually interested in him as a person, or if she was more interested in the story he represented. But over time, as the relationship deepened and the complications multiplied and she chose him anyway, she had come to understand that love wasn't about certainty. It was about commitment in the face of uncertainty. It was about choosing someone not because you were sure you were making the right choice, but because you were willing to take the risk that you were. Marcus had risen to his position on the tribal council with increasing effectiveness. He worked on education initiatives and drug prevention programs. He advocated for the preservation of Apache language and culture, while also pushing the community toward accepting changes and new ways of doing things. It was a delicate balance, and not everyone appreciated his approach. But he did the work anyway, with integrity and commitment. Sarah eventually returned to filmmaking, but on her own terms. She created documentaries about communities and cultures that were often marginalized. She brought her mixed-race children with her sometimes to film shoots, and they grew up seeing their mother as a woman with agency and purpose, not just as someone defined by her relationships. The documentary that started it all was eventually used in universities across the country as a teaching tool about Native American communities, about intercultural relationships, about how communities negotiate change and tradition. Sarah had initially wanted to remove it from circulation after Emma was born. afraid it exposed too much of their personal life. But Marcus had convinced her otherwise. "It's important," he said. "Our story, what we built, it's important because it shows that these things are possible, that love can cross boundaries, that communities can evolve, that individuals don't have to choose between belonging and authenticity." In the years that followed, Sarah and Marcus became something like a model for the possibility of intercultural relationships. They were invited to speak at conferences, to mentor young people navigating similar challenges. But they were always careful to represent themselves accurately, to acknowledge the difficulties as well as the rewards, to make clear that their success was not inevitable or easy. On an anniversary trip, 10 years after Sarah had first driven into the community as a stranger with expensive camera equipment, they returned to the spot where they had first really talked. It wasn't the diner anymore. The diner had closed years ago, replaced by a newer establishment. But the view of the mountains was the same. The way the light fell on the rocks in the early evening was the same. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" Marcus asked. "Which part?" Sarah replied.
When I said I was emotionally exhausted and just wanted pie.
He laughed. "That, but also when you said you didn't know if we were on a date."
I did ask that.
Sarah remembered. "I wanted to know your intention, and I think I've done that. I think I know you better than I've ever known anyone, but I also think there's still so much more to discover." Sarah reached over and took his hand, looking out at the mountains that had become as much a part of her home as the person next to her. "That's why I'm still here," she said, "because there's always more to discover. Because knowing you better is something I want to spend my entire life doing." And when Emma asked her mother, years later in her own adulthood, if she had ever regretted the moment she decided to stay, Sarah realized that the question was rooted in a misunderstanding. There had never been a moment when she decided to stay. There had been a series of moments, hundreds of them, thousands of them, where she decided again and again to stay, where she woke up and chose this life, this man, this community, where she recommitted to the vision of herself she had created in this place. "No," she said, "I've never regretted it, not even for a moment." And when Emma asked if her mother loved Marcus, Sarah smiled because that was the easiest question to answer.
More than anything, she said, which is why I was able to tell him, completely and honestly, that I was his.
Completely and utterly. When you love someone that much, belonging to them becomes the most liberating thing in the world because you know it's chosen. Every single day you know it's chosen.